Good evening. So I'm curious, as I look out into the crowd, how many of you are high school students?
I love you, Miss Murphy.
Oh my God. I didn't say my high school students, I said just high school students. Once again, if this is your first psychology evening lecture here at MCC, I want to encourage you to attend more of these. They offer 3 or 4 each semester, and they're always so interesting. I have attended lectures on topics like the influence of culture, and one of my favorites was the psychology of superheroes. So keep an eye out for the listing of the evening lecture series. I know sometimes you get extra credit, yes? I hope all of you high school students are getting extra credit. Mr. Reed? Are yours getting extra credit? Oh, good. Mine are too. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. I am really excited to be here, and I am obviously very excited about the topic. Let's start off with raise your hand if you're my student and this is an everyday occurrence with me.
Every other day.
Okay, so give me a minute. And this is every day. No lie. It's freezing. Give me a minute. No, really, this is every day.
Do you need a paper clip?
We'll let technology take a moment to think about this. So, I am interested in tonight's topic because I really love crime shows. Does anybody else in here love crime shows? Okay, a few of you, right? Some of you don't maybe have as much time for television because you're very busy working and going to school. But how about if you shout out some of your favorite crime shows? Criminal Minds?
Yes.
What else? Dexter. CSI what? Okay, CSI.
Name a 10.
Mindhunter. Well, I will let you guess my favorite with this next slide. Yeah, I didn't put that soundbite in there. I had somebody else do it for me. Technology and I don't exactly get along. So, podcasts, rip from the headline stories, documentaries on serial killers, dramatizations. Most of us are very drawn to these sorts of things. I know that I am a confessed Law and Order addict. I have seen every episode many times, and the show's been around since 1990, so that lets you know how old I am. Anyway, and what I wanted to focus on is looking at some of the biological influences on crime. But before I start, I wanted to just make a note. Your psychology teachers are probably somewhat irritated when a new movie or TV show portrays certain aspects of psychology, particularly the area of psychological disorders, not accurately. So I wanted to point out that when you watch these shows, just keep in mind that there is some amount of artistic license that occurs and added effects for dramatization. Although there are many different influences in violence and aggression and criminal behavior. I'm just going to barely scratch the surface with looking at some of the biological influences, looking at a couple brain structures. I'm only going to cover one hormone and one neurotransmitter. We'll take a brief look at the influence of genetics also tonight. Much of the research I'm discussing comes from a truly fascinating book called The Anatomy of Violence. And this is by Dr. Adrian Raine. He's a neurocriminologist at the University of Pennsylvania. And if what I talk about tonight piques your interest, please consider getting your hands on this book and reading it. It is truly a fascinating read. So we'll start with looking at some brain anatomy. We will touch upon the amygdala, but also I want to talk about the frontal lobe. So we'll come back to the amygdala in just a minute. So before I start, I want to go way back in time, and I want to discuss a story. I'll tell this story because not everybody in the audience has heard this, although I suspect many of you have, maybe several times. But we'll go all the way back to 1848, when 25-year-old Phineas Gage was working on the railroad, and they were using blasting powder. What could go wrong? Unfortunately, something went very wrong, and there was a tragic accident that managed to blow a tamping iron through his left frontal lobe. Surprisingly, he survived the accident. In fact, he was able to walk, he was able to speak, he was able to later find a job doing something else, not with blasting powder. He did have some seizures, but otherwise he seemed fine, except there was a distinct change in his behavior that people reported. They said that he no longer seemed like himself. This was a man who understood social norms. He understood how to behave appropriately in public. He understood that at the time there were certain things that you did and didn't say or do in front of ladies. But after the accident, that seemed to change, and he seemed to lose that, what we call in our house, the internal governor, that reminds you how you should act and how you should think before you act. And what this story gives us is that this area of the brain has a pretty big influence on our ability to regulate our behavior. So in speaking of the frontal lobe, what is the frontal lobe? What does it do? What are some of its functions? Go ahead and yell it out.
Reasoning.
Okay, reasoning, thinking through consequences, decision making. What? Restraint. Especially with restraining impulsive behavior, absolutely. Reasoning, judgment, decision making, keeping from acting impulsively without stopping to think first before acting. So Dr. Raine in 1997 looked at some neuroimaging of some criminals and also of some healthy controls. And what he found was the criminals had less activity here in the prefrontal cortex, as you see up at the top. And that would lead us to suspect that criminals might not have that same ability to think about, reason through, and think through their actions before acting, that they might act without restraint, so to speak. Dr. Cavanis, in 2011, conducted a study called the Vietnam Head Injury Study. Now, Dr. Cavanis was a Korean War survivor and a neurologist, and he took over 1,000 Vietnam veterans, and he had 3 groups. He had a group of veterans who had damage specifically to the prefrontal cortex. He had another group with damage to some other area of the brain, and he had a third group that didn't have any brain damage at all. And then he had some questionnaires and had their families do some observations and collected the data and found that the group with specifically the damage to the prefrontal cortex exhibited more aggression and more acts of violence than either of the other 2 groups. And further information gathered and some neuroimaging techniques have led researchers to determine that damage to the prefrontal cortex is indeed going to lead to a higher likelihood of aggressive or violent behavior. Another area of the brain is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So that's down here. Ventral means bottom or below. So this area has been found through research to be very influential in our ability to make decisions. They've conducted research with subjects and found that subjects who had some sort of lesioning or damage to their ventromedial prefrontal cortex would make poor decisions that led to negative consequences. And then once they'd learned the negative consequences of their poor decisions, they still ended up making the same poor decisions. They didn't seem to be able to change their decision making into healthier decisions. Just a moment. What's interesting about the subjects in the study of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is their other intellectual abilities, their other cognitive abilities rather, so memory, IQ, those abilities were intact despite the lesioning in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So you can see that these areas of the brain are pretty influential in helping us with our judgment, our reasoning, our decision making, and also in controlling some of our more aggressive behaviors. Now, some of the studies I'm discussing tonight are correlational studies, and it's important to keep in mind that correlation does not equal causation. You've been taught well. So we don't always have causation. I'd also like to point out at this point, when looking at neuroimaging, a normal, healthy, control subject, you see a lot of higher level thinking happening here in the frontal lobe, but in the neuroimaging of a convicted murderer, you see less activity. And what do you think you would see in a serial killer? Which one of these would be most like a serial killer? Left or right? Left. The left.
Really?
Why would that be?
Can get away with it.
Because if they're a serial killer, they have to be able to keep ahead of the police. They have to be able to make decisions. They have to pick good targets. They need these breathing skills to keep ahead of their being caught.
Exactly. Think about the amount of planning that would be involved in being a long-term serial killer. If you're a long-term serial killer, easy for me to say, you haven't been caught yet. So you must be using some pretty good reasoning and decision making to evade capture. Another area of the brain I wanted to discuss is the amygdala. Now, your amygdalae are these little teeny tiny almond-shaped clusters located near the end of your hippocampus. And these are located deep, deep, deep into your temporal lobes. What is the function of the amygdala?
Regulates emotion, aggression, appetite.
Wow, nice. Absolutely. So your amygdala is the seat of your emotion, and it is quite influential in your emotion of fear. Now, studies looking into the function of the amygdala and the fear response, they've done things like take monkeys and lesion their amygdalae, and what they found was that the monkeys lost their sense of fear. Additionally, they seem to lose their ability to perceive a threat. Now, there are some humans who have damage to their amygdalae. They typically have this damage as a result of disease or a stroke, and that brings with it some additional issues. But there is one very interesting study by Feinstein of a woman known as SM due to confidentiality, and she had damage to her amygdalae because she had a genetic condition. So this genetic condition resulted in bilateral lesions to her amygdala in both hemispheres of her brain. Other areas of intellect and memory, language, all of those other cognitive abilities were just fine. But she was known to have no fear. So Feinstein set out to investigate this lack of a fear response in SM. She was 44 years old at the time. And one of the most common fears, well, some of the most common fears have an evolutionary basis. Do you know one of those?
Fear of the dark.
Fear of the dark.
Okay.
Snakes.
Snakes.
Spiders.
Spiders.
Swimming rattlesnakes.
That was very specific. Snakes, spiders, storms. It's hard to do an experiment with storms, so they picked the next best option, and they asked SM, how do you feel about spiders and snakes? And SM thought about it, and she said, I don't really care for them. No, I hate them. I tried to stay away from them as much as possible. So the researchers decided to test that out to see if that was true, if she really did have an aversion to snakes or what might have been actually a fear. And the best place to do that would be an exotic pet store. So they took SM to an exotic pet store and observed her reactions. And she was fascinated. She was fascinated by how smooth the scales on the snake felt under her fingertips. She looked at the snakes closely. She asked to even hold one of the snakes. And then she asked to hold an even bigger snake. And then she asked to hold an even bigger snake. It finally ended, as far as I can recall, that she asked to hold the tarantula in the store. So they were pretty much able to conclude that she had no fear response to snakes and spiders, as you might expect many people to have. They wanted to do something else investigating this lack of a fear response. So they decided a slightly more controlled condition would be to take SM to what was known as one of the most haunted places in the world. They thought a perfect scenario would be a haunted house, right? Has anybody been to Fear Farm? Okay, yeah, I heard that. Ooh. So, the haunted house was located in an old sanitarium. The makeup on the people hired to work the haunted house, the monsters, if you will, was shockingly realistic. But Feinstein et al. Decided they also needed to take along 5 other people as controls. So let's look at SM's response in the haunted house. Let's look at the response of 5 other people. And these were 5 people unknown to SM. And so as they observed SM and the others walking through one of the most terrifying haunted houses available, SM became really excited and said things like, "Come on guys, let's go down here." And she was observed laughing. She was so fascinated by the makeup on the monsters that she reached out to touch the face of one of the monsters. At one point, I'm not sure what she did, but she managed to actually scare one of the monsters. So who knows what that was about. And the 5 controls were more like I would be. Well, I wouldn't be there at all. But the 5 controls were more typical. They were observed screaming, running, and demonstrating that they were absolutely frightened to, I won't say to death. They were very, very frightened. And so what was happening in the controls was there was a perception of a threat activating the amygdala. The amygdala sent the information to the hypothalamus that it needed to activate a fight or flight response with the autonomic nervous system. And then their adrenal glands on top of their kidneys were probably secreting adrenaline to then enable them to have the strength to either fight this threat or to flee in terror. I'm all for fleeing in terror. That sounds horrifying. So what does this mean for criminals? Perhaps it means that if they have a damaged amygdala, or maybe they have a hypoactive or underactive amygdala, they're not afraid of anything. They're not afraid of the danger that they're involved in. They're not afraid of getting caught. They're not afraid of what punishment might meet them once they do get caught. Excuse me. So I want to move on to yet another biological influence, and I want to speak about hormones, only one. I want to speak about testosterone. So hormones are the messenger system in your the messengers of your endocrine system, and testosterone has long been studied for its correlation to aggressive behavior. Many animal studies have been conducted investigating the link between testosterone levels and aggression, and they have conducted studies where they've looked at incarcerated criminals and found that their testosterone levels tend to be significantly higher. They've also done studies using functional MRIs and found that testosterone also has an influence on the activation of our amygdala. So yet another tie. So Radke et al. In 2015 conducted an interesting study where they had participants look at what appeared to be faces coming toward them. Some of the faces were happy and some of the faces were angry. They had injected the participants with a low dose of testosterone to raise their testosterone levels. And then what the subjects were to do was to make a decision whether to approach or avoid these faces that were also approaching them. And what's really interesting is that when it came to the angry faces, they chose to approach the angry faces or the perceived threat. I taught junior high too. We good? That's okay. I've got a teacher voice. Can you hear me? Oh, there's a microphone. An interesting note to Radke's study. See, these were female participants. And what this tells us is that testosterone tends to heighten the threat and aggression-related brain activity, both in men and in women.
Don't mind me.
Don't mind her. It's all good. Nicely done. Oh, the other thing, sorry, I got a little distracted. The other thing I wanted to point out is that this added testosterone and this desire to approach a threat may seem to indicate that criminals might be more willing to it's up there. Okay. That's okay. Might be willing to approach a perceived threat because they feel braver. Or you might say maybe they're just more foolish. Another biological influence is neurotransmitters. I'm going to speak specifically only about serotonin tonight. Neurotransmitters are those speedy electrochemical messengers in the brain. And serotonin has been found in animal studies to have an effect on aggression. What else do we know about serotonin? What does it influence? Sleep. What else? Mood. And it also has an influence on impulsivity and aggression. Again, we have some animal studies that show a relationship that it does influence aggression, but it doesn't really tell us how it influences aggression. But thanks to technology, bless you, Bustamante et al. In 2012 was able to conduct an interesting study where they gave participants a drink that lowered their serotonin levels. Then they had the participants look at pictures of faces displaying different emotions. And what they found was really interesting. They found that by reducing the participants' serotonin levels, they found a correlation with reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, but only when looking at angry faces. So it happens when they're looking at what would be perceived as a threat. So it seems that serotonin has the effect of maybe keeping us from thinking before acting when we perceive a social threat. And if someone has a tendency toward violence, they may not stop to think first before acting impulsively. So we've looked at a couple structures in the brain. We've discussed a hormone, a neurotransmitter. But have you ever wondered if perhaps people are just born violent? I know I have. So we can look at a variety of behaviors and kind of tease out the influence of genetics and environment by using twin studies. So researchers love twin studies. They can take fraternal twins who share 50% DNA, no more than any other siblings, and essentially it's the same environment, and compare them to twins who are identical, who share 100% DNA, they're virtual clones of one another, and they also have virtually the same environment. And they can use it to look at the heritability of things like aggression and violence and rates of committing crimes. And Dr. Rain and colleague Baker in 2007 conducted a study of over 1,200 twins in California. And these twins had been identified at a young age as displaying antisocial behavior. Now, antisocial behavior is an excellent predictor of future criminal activity. And antisocial behavior includes a whole range of things: bullying, cruelty, lying, stealing, disregard for rules or the law, no sense of concern over one's own safety, no sense of concern over the safety of other people. And they wanted to try to figure out the heritability. They used a variety of methods and found that it came out, just like many things, looking about equally influential genetics and environment. They added another study where they took identical twins, separated at birth, and that was a little bit less of an influence of genetics, but roughly equally influential genetics and environment. So something else to consider is the Mao-a gene. Now, the Mao-a gene is monoamine oxidase A. It's an enzyme, and it affects neurotransmitters like serotonin. And they have found that there is a particular low activity variation of the Mao-a gene that correlates with antisocial behavior. They've even tried to combine some genetics and environment and looked at when there is this variation of the Mao-a gene and child abuse, and found that that has a high likelihood of leading to future violent behavior. And that would explain also, perhaps, why some children who have been victims of abuse don't always grow up to be violent later as adults. Give you a minute to think about that. Sorry. Find me some water. Okay. Go to the water fountain. Thank you. My husband said no, so my student's going to do it. Sorry. There was a key finding in the research conducted on the Mao-a gene, this particular low activity variation of the Mao-a gene, and found that those with this variation have greater activity in their amygdala during emotional arousal, plus less activity in their ventromedial prefrontal cortex compared to people who have a typical Mao-a gene. So that points again to the idea that threat activation with less thought and active decision making during emotional arousal could be a strong factor in criminal behavior. Oh, did I not mention that the Mao-a gene is known as the warrior gene because of its ties to antisocial behavior? I apologize. So this warrior gene has ties to the antisocial behavior that, as I mentioned earlier, has pretty good prediction value for future criminal behavior. So if you were hoping that tonight we were going to specifically be able to identify that exact root biological cause of criminal behavior, I think you're going to go home disappointed. We can see that there are so many different biological influences, and as I said, we've just started to scratch the surface of some of the biological influences. This book is full of them. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that whenever we're looking at any human behavior, it's always a good idea to take a biopsychosocial approach, where we take into account all the different factors, biology, psychological influences, and sociocultural factors as well. And essentially, any environmental factor can have an influence in shaping a person's behavior. In addition to all the biological factors, there are numerous cognitive factors and environmental factors that come into play. And honestly, those would be a second and a third lecture easily. So Dr. Rain points out that some of the environmental factors that may have an influence. You're the best. You get more extra credit than anybody else. Thank you. That environmental factors could be something like when, unfortunately, sometimes people shake babies when they're crying, which often leads to head trauma, and as you may have guessed, some damage to the prefrontal cortex. And since we know that damage to the prefrontal cortex correlates with aggressive behavior, you can imagine how damaging that is, in addition to many other reasons why it's just a really awful thing to do. Other environmental influences, lead exposure. Exposure to lead can lead to reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex. Another environmental factor is maternal alcohol use during pregnancy. That also can lead to reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex. Numerous factors. I always wonder when I watch those crime shows, is it genetics? Is it environment? What could it be? Is it they had a rough home life? They were abused as a child? They have just a bad gene? We're not going to be able to go too much more into detail, just keep in mind there are so many different factors involved, too numerous to list in this one evening lecture. I did want to cover some interesting legal implications. This brings up, this field of neurocriminology brings up some philosophical quandaries. And these philosophical quandaries center around this idea that if people committing some of these crimes are doing so with a damaged amygdala, or with head trauma that's damaged their prefrontal cortex, should they be punished as harshly as everybody else? Dr. Rain would argue, no, he would argue that they are actually less responsible for their crimes. In fact, Dr. Rain was hired as a consultant on a case of a man named Herbert Weinstein. And Herbert Weinstein had killed his wife. But what they found with neuroimaging is that he had a very large cyst in his frontal cortex, which likely caused him some cognitive difficulties. And because of that, his lawyers were able to give that as evidence, and he accepted a plea deal so that his punishment for killing his wife was only 11 years because he was found less responsible, less culpable for his behavior. Another interesting case is that of Antonio Bustamante. Antonio Bustamante, okay, he committed a lot of crimes. In fact, he was facing the death penalty. It was bad. But what happened was his lawyers found out that he had suffered a pretty severe head injury, and with neuroimaging, not a lot of higher level thinking, not a lot of activity that you would see here in his frontal lobe. There's some serious gaps. And this neuroimaging was used in the court case, and he was able to escape the death penalty. I mean, he was still punished, but he wasn't sentenced to death, again, because the view was that he was less culpable for his crime than someone with a healthier functioning brain. So what could this mean for the future? There was an interesting study by Dr. Rain where he and his team identified some children with some behavior difficulties, conduct disorder, bordering on some antisocial behavior. And he conducted his study with omega-3 fatty acid supplements, fish oil. Why do you think he used fish oil?
It helps with brain health.
Thank you. Exactly. Fish oil helps with brain health. They put together a study where they had one group of these children receiving a drink with the omega-3 fatty acid supplement in it, and the control group had a drink without the omega-3 fatty acid supplement in it. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to study the children over a year's time. And an additional factor to this is they also wanted the caregivers to take note of their own behavior, their own psychological aggression. Some of you in the audience who have children, or maybe you don't even have to have children to know this, that sometimes when there is a child with explosive behavior, defiant behavior, oppositional behavior, it causes some stress in the home, and it can cause some strained relationships between the caregivers. So they also wanted to track that. And what's beautiful is they used a double-blind procedure. So that means that neither the children nor the caregivers dispensing the drinks nor the experimenters directly involved in the study knew which of the children were receiving the supplements and which of the children were not. And over the course of the year, they had the caregivers filling out checklists, noting their behavior, noting their own behavior and possible psychological aggression between the caregivers. And at the end of the year, they found that the children who had received the omega-3 fatty acid supplements in their drinks demonstrated improved behavior and less aggression. And then the other piece of it was that the caregivers also experience less fighting and arguments between themselves. So the reason why I bring this study up is there is the ability to identify children early on as having risk factors for what could be potentially future aggressive or violent or even criminal behavior. And there are also many studies being conducted to look at ways to intervene. The child's brain is so flexible and has that neuroplasticity that bad behavior, that antisocial behavior, that aggressive behavior isn't necessarily fixed. There are interventions that they have found to be effective at several points, including social interventions. So there is hope. Also, it's important to understand that when it comes to, say, juvenile delinquent behavior, that only 1 out of 5 juvenile delinquents tend to go on to commit crimes as adults. So it is a low percentage, and that does offer us even more hope. Understand, criminal behavior in children is not a fixed behavior. So I hope that tonight you got a little glimpse into some of the various biological influences into human behavior when it comes to aggression, violence, and criminality. And when you watch your favorite crime shows, and I'm just gonna say right now, I will continue obsessively watching Law and Order. My apologies to my husband who has to live with that. I hope when you watch it, you feel like you've got a nice glimpse into what might be going on, what factors might be influencing people to be the way they are. And again, because we've only scratched the surface, if you find your interest piqued, I highly recommend you pick up Dr. Rain's book, The Anatomy of Violence. It is an absolutely fascinating read. Thank you so much for being here tonight.